Hi, this is Steve Platek for Sex, Evolution, and Behavior program for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today, I'm talking with both Professor Gordon Gallup from the University of Albany, SUNY, and Dr. Jennifer Bremser from Alfred State, also in New York. And today we're going to be talking about the topic waist-to-hip ratio and shoulder-to-hip ratio with respect to sex, evolution, and behavior. Gordon, do you want to start us off by giving us a little background about the importance of waist-to-hip ratio and shoulder-to-hip ratio?
That sounds good, Steve. Let me just give you a little bit of background. I'm interested, as are both you and Jen, in the biology of interpersonal attraction, or what some people refer to as the science of sex appeal. And it turns out that the evidence suggests that features that we find attractive in members of the opposite sex frequently signal reproductively relevant information. And to the extent that evolution involves competition for genetic representation in subsequent generations, the best way to piggyback your genes into the next generation is to pair them with someone who's reproductively viable. And that's the reason we find different features attractive in members of the opposite sex. People with attractive features frequently are more reproductively viable. And that's why we've evolved to find these features preferentially attractive. And one of the dimensions, one of many dimensions of interpersonal attraction from a basic biological evolutionary perspective in humans is body configuration. Females tend to have what some people refer to as hourglass figures, relatively narrow waists and broader hips, whereas in contrast, males tend to have wedge-shaped torsos, relatively broad shoulders and narrow hips. And you can quantify these sex differences in body configuration by computing what are called waist-to-hip ratios and shoulder-to-hip ratios. So in the case of waist-to-hip ratios, if you take the width of a woman's waist and divide that by the width of her hips, that gives you what's called her waist-to-hip ratio. And the smaller the waist-to-hip ratio, the more accentuated the woman's hourglass figure. So that women, say, for example, with waist-to-hip ratios of 0.7, have waists that are only 70% of the width of their hips. And you can do the same thing for males by computing what are called shoulder-to-hip ratios. So if you take the width of a male's shoulders and divide that by the width of their hips, that gives you their shoulder-to-hip ratios. And males typically have shoulder-to-hip ratios that exceed 1, whereas females have waist-to-hip ratios that are less than 1. And waist-to-hip ratios have received a lot of attention recently in terms of a major dimension of interpersonal attraction. Males tend to rate females with waist-to-hip ratios of less than 1 as being more attractive. And most of the evidence suggests that optimal waist-to-hip ratios in females tend to be around 0.7. They've done a number of surveys involving Playboy models as well as film stars, and they typically find that the aggregate or mean waist-to-hip ratio among these high-profile females is close to 0.7. Females with low waist-to-hip ratios are not only more reproductively viable, they have more regular menstrual cycles, they ovulate on a more regular basis, they're more likely to conceive as a result of artificial insemination, but females with low waist-to-hip ratios are also demonstrably healthier. As waist-to-hip ratios goes down, the risk of various diseases also diminishes. Females with low waist-to-hip ratios also have more attractive voices. They tend to lose their virginity at earlier ages. They have more sex partners. And we've shown that they're also more prone to engage in infidelity, extra pair copulations. The other interesting dimension to waist-to-hip ratios among females is that a narrow waist and broad hips signals, among other things, that a female is not pregnant. In the course of becoming pregnant and with advancing pregnancy, you lose your hourglass figure through an abdominal enlargement and the like. So you can use waist-to-hip ratios in females to index pregnancy. And males, obviously, that invested preferentially in pregnant females during evolutionary history left fewer descendants, because pregnant females have lost the capacity to be re-impregnated. Likewise, a pregnant female is likely to be carrying another male's offspring, and therefore males that avoided investing in pregnant females had a lower risk of being cuckolded. The other feature of low waist-to-hip ratios in terms of a signal is that waist-to-hip ratios consist of soft tissue features as well as underlying skeletal features. And any forensic anthropologist can tell you that the skeletal pelvic morphology of a female is fundamentally different from that of a male, and therefore broad hips signals a female's capacity for a relatively unencumbered childbirth. And the reason this was important is that cesarean sections were not an option during 99.9% of human evolutionary history, and females that had difficult deliveries or females that couldn't deliver their infants either died or had disadvantageous kinds of birthing experiences that were harmful both to the female and the infant. Therefore, males that mated preferentially with females with broad hips would have had a reproductive advantage.
Absolutely. And what my team has done is followed up with that. And what we've demonstrated is that biological signal of waist-to-hip ratio, in particular waist-to-hip ratio, is seen by the male brain when using fMRI scanners as significantly rewarding. That is, the area of the brain that's active, the nucleus accumbens, is active when individuals see sexual images, when they ingest chocolate, are injected with drugs of addiction. It's essentially what we call the holy grail of reward. And it turns out that the male brain has been uniquely tuned, I think, through evolutionary pressures, to be receptive to this optimal design to drive exactly what you're talking about, these reproductive advantages, reproductive opportunities. That is, let's target our reproductive biology and behavior towards those individuals that are going to most likely maximize our reproductive outcome. And it turns out that those things just happen to be really attractive and rewarding to us, in the sense that we like to look at them, and they're the objects of things like pornography and advertisements. And what a great advertisement tool they are, because they captivate our brain. One of the things that we discovered was that, unlike what you would maybe surmise from reading a popular magazine on health and wellness, maybe Muscle and Fitness or something like that, body mass index had no effect on the reward centers of the brain. And that's contrary to what a lot of people are suggesting is important. In fact, the American Medical Association will classify individuals on the body mass index, of which I classify as near obese. I like to think that I'm not nearly obese, and so it's interesting to think that at the level of the brain, the ultimate mechanisms that you spoke about in terms of reproductive opportunities and signals actually has as what we think an evolved neurocognitive proximate mechanism, which is this reward mechanism in the brain.
Exactly. It's the configuration of a person's body and not their body mass per se that seems to impact their perception of other people and the degree to which they find them as attractive. It's worth just inserting just a minor footnote at this point to the effect that shoulder to hip ratios in males are parallel signals. Males with broad shoulders and narrow hips tend to have higher testosterone. They tend to be healthier, and they tend to excel on tests of physical prowess, like grip strength. And just like females, males with high shoulder to hip ratios lose their virginity sooner. They have more sex partners, and they're also more prone to infidelity.
Well, let me ask you both a question. And Jen, we're going to get to your new hypothesis and new research and dissertation research in just a minute, actually. But I've been asked this a lot. And as both an academic and the owner of a physical fitness facility, can one secondarily optimize their waist to hip ratio or shoulder to hip ratio? And in a sense, I know the answer to this, but I'd like to hear your take on this. Can they dupe evolution's signaling or perceptual mechanism? That is, if I go into the gym and let's say I have low testosterone or something like that, and I do lots of whatever exercise to make me look like I have a big shoulder to hip ratio, is that artificial enhancement detectable, or do you perceive it's detectable?
Well, let me respond real quick, Steve. Any attempt to manipulate your body configuration, either through exercise or through surgical supplements, is what's called dishonest advertising. Because those features are not transmittable. Those features belie the underlying genes that code for body configuration. And it's the reason we find body configuration important in the last analysis is because it signals certain underlying genetic traits that have reproductive value, and therefore attempts to exaggerate these traits or to embellish these traits amounts to what's called dishonest signaling or dishonest advertising. And what you would predict is that in the future there's going to be with the increasing availability of surgical strategies for manipulating body configuration, is there's going to be selection for males that can distinguish between genuine and disingenuous traits.
So the reason I ask is because I get in verbal battles with colleagues sometimes about the same, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. That leads my colleagues and I, and perhaps just my colleagues down here in the South, to think about things like genetic determinism, right? And so does that then lead me to think that if I'm not, quote unquote, optimally designed with respect to shoulder hip ratio, I'm shit out of luck with respect to reproductive opportunities? Yes. Well, the answer is yes.
Well, I think in a way it's yes, but in another way, it's important to realize that genes express themselves differently in different environments.
Certainly.
So, you could take two people that have genes that both code for favorable body configurations, but if that person is in an nutritionally impoverished environmental situation, their body configuration is not going to be nearly as attractive.
Right.
So whereas mate choice involves phenotype, selection always focuses on genotype.
Right. I don't know. I think the answer is the same, though. The epigenetic phenomenon of being reared in a nutritionally deficient environment and not expressing those genes. There's going to be individuals who have superior genes who express the optimal signals in lieu of nutritional deficiencies.
Well, to the extent that any of the variants in appearance is due to underlying differences in genes, that's the basis for selection.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No question about it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's shift gears. Jen, tell us what you did for your dissertation with respect to waist to hip ratio and shoulder to hip ratio, and tell me about some new ideas that you and Gordon are thinking about with respect to these topics and different diseases.
Sure. We kind of were taking the angle of some research that had been done several years ago, looking at the relationship between waist to hip ratio and cognition. And some of that research that was done by Lasik and Gallen had shown that you can actually account for a small but significant percentage of variance in cognition, general cognitive abilities of women, by looking at waist to hip ratio. And so they were able to show that you could explain about 7% of the variance in general cognitive abilities as a function of waist to hip ratio. And so they were looking at it from the angle of gluteofemoral fat, and the composition of fat that's stored below the waist is different from than the fat that's stored above the waist. And estrogen is what codes for the fat to be stored below the waist. And that fat tends to be high in long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids like DHA, and those can become resources for brain-building resources. And so females that had lower waist-to-hip ratios would presumably have higher gluteofemoral fat stores, which would go and perhaps help provide more brain-building resources for their offspring. And so they actually even concluded that they could account for variance in the offspring of women. They could account for variance in the cognitive abilities of low waist to hip ratio women. I'm saying that wrong. They were able to account for variance in the offspring of children who had low waist to hip ratios, so that they could explain about 2.7% of the variance, knowing that they may have been providing an advantage, a cognitive advantage, perhaps to their children on account of the stored fat that they had. And we were interested in taking things a little bit further. For instance, we know that waist to hip ratio is a sexually dimorphic feature, and females have this different configuration than males do. We were wondering if it's due to underlying differences in estrogen or hormone levels that might be circulating at puberty, if you could also look at some sexually differentiated aspects of cognition and see if waist to hip ratio might be able to explain some of those differences we see. And one area where we do see differences concerns social intelligence. And social intelligence is a collection of skills that goes into how we think about and behave when we're in groups. And in particular, it might look at how we take into account what other people are thinking or what they know when they're not lying to us, right? So when we might take information from how they're reacting in a certain situation and try to build an idea or a theory of what that person might be thinking. And so we reasoned that waist to hip ratio might relate to other sexually dimorphic aspects of cognition, such as theory of mind, which is our ability to consider someone else's thoughts, intentions, and compare and contrast them to our own. And this skill, theory of mind, actually builds or paves the way for empathy. And we know that there's sex difference within empathy. So we looked at waist to hip ratio as a function of theory of mind performance and empathizing. And our data was pretty compelling in that we were able to explain about 20% of the variance in performance on theory of mind tasks by looking at waist to hip ratio in some females.
So would you hypothesize that the link to brain mechanisms associated with empathy and theory of mind are also linked to gluteofemoral stores of long-chain polyunsaturated fats like DHA? Or do you think it could be some other kind? And for our listeners, DHA is a form of omega fatty acid that is found in fish oil and various vegetation and beef and that sort of thing. Do you think it's the same kind of structure? At which point do we start to raise the question of whether general cognitive function is not isolated or modularized from theory of mind and social intelligence?
Well, I think that the common thread that we were looking at, or the common denominator would be estrogen levels at puberty. And those are, we know that puberty is a time of great brain reorganization. The structures have been put in place early in development, and we know that hormones have played a role organizationally, but another time at which hormones really reshape or reconfigure the brain is at puberty. And if you look at some of the triggers to puberty in terms of the brain changes that take place, you can look at things like leptin in fat stores. So I think that the fat might be signaling that it's time for puberty to start the process of puberty, but really both waist to hip ratio and potentially the theory of mind skills and empathizing that we were looking at depend upon estrogen levels. So someone who has greater estrogen levels or more estrogen circulating through their body may have a more pronounced waist to hip ratio, and they may also have more pronounced empathizing or theory of mind skills.
But it's probably because of the fact that estrogen levels are correlated with these long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Right. So it's being mediated by these critical fatty acids that have been identified as building blocks of healthy neuronal and brain development, particularly in infants, as well as in the mothers themselves. But Jen's data, I think, implicate modularity in that Gallup and Lassik's data show that waist-to-hip ratios only account for about 7% of the variance in performance on cognitive tests. We found that waist-to-hip ratios account for over 20% of the variance on tests of theory of mind and empathy, suggesting that these long-chain fatty acids that are stored in a woman's hips are there because of factors that may be relevant to women with accentuated waist-to-hip ratios. And women with accentuated waist-to-hip ratios, because they're seen as attractive, are probably more likely to be targeted by males for attempts at seduction. And to the extent that males engage in dishonest courtship by feigning good intentions in order to gain sexual favors, women with high levels of these long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids may excel at being able to infer and take into account and identify instances of disingenuous claims of commitment by these males. Jen's also pointed out that mothers with broad hips and narrow waists, because of these higher levels of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, may be better at empathizing with their infants and identifying instances of distress or behavioral problems so that they can be more effective in taking intervention strategies designed to optimize the well-being of their babies.
So then that raises a question to me, and I think that really clears things up. But in terms of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids and dietary intake, there's a huge variance today than what there was, say, in our ancestral past, right? And this is part of our so-called mismatch hypothesis for diets, and the fact that most of our diets today are abundant with omega-6 fatty acids, which are potentially detrimental, particularly to females, if you read some of Gallen's work, and whatever. Gallen was summarizing other people's work, right? So is it the case that our diet now could be influencing not only our body morphology, but also our brain subtype?
Well, I think because there's less variance at least in the Western world nowadays in diet and the availability of adequate foods than was true for most of human evolutionary history. For most of human evolutionary history, it was a matter of feast or famine, periods in which food was readily available and periods in which food was scarce. Nowadays, because of modern agriculture, we've created what amounts to a situation in which we encounter a continuous feast. Food is widely available in almost unlimited quantities and qualities. So nowadays, because of the widespread availability of food, the nutritional environment is much more constant, which makes the underlying genetic differences stand out in relief.
However, I mean, there's been good data to suggest in lieu of the fact that we're in a perpetual feast, that perpetual feast is one of suboptimal fatty acid varieties, right? So, for example, like cows that are, mass-produced cows and corn and all that, loaded with not DHA, but omega-6 fatty acids that might actually be detrimental, causing things like cancer and insulin resistance and what have you. So, I mean, I guess maybe that's another point that would make the genetic variation stand out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The ability to deal with
Yeah.
these other less desirable side effects.
Yeah. And what's interesting is it does not seem to bear on shoulder to hip ratio, because it seems like men have some kind of sexually dimorphic preferential ability to deal with an omega-6 overload, where females are affected in a much worse way to an omega-6, omega-3 invariance. But what we're talking about now is really interesting. And what we're talking about now is broaching the field of Darwinian medicine. And I wonder, because your topic of theory of mind and estrogen seems to come right from Baron Cohen's idea of systemizing, empathizing brain quotients, if I think that's what they're called, quotients. And so does this estrogenization of the female and waist to hip ratio and empathy, does this bear in any way on any kind of disease states? In other words, are we going to see something? Baron Cohen talks a lot about the autistic mind and the extreme male brain, and we're talking about diet, omega-6 fatty acids, etc. Is there something to be said here for, aside from being a female who's optimally waist to hip ratio designed and has lots of these fatty acids, and that might put you in a unique position to be able to read the minds of suitors who want to deceive you into one night stands or what have you? Is there an extreme end of this that can, because we certainly, while low waist to hip ratio is considered optimal, extremely low waist to hip ratio is anomalous and looks unusual, right? It stands out like a sore thumb, and it's not attractive.
Steve, you might want to insert at this point some of those slides I sent you that illustrate some of the outliers in terms of females with waist to hip ratios that are even less than 0.7. I think there's one that shows a female with a waist to hip ratio of 0.5. Likewise, you can show some of the outliers for shoulder to hip ratios in males, where males that use anabolic steroids can greatly exaggerate the width of their shoulders relative to the width of their hips. I think there was one slide of a obviously steroid driven male with a shoulder to hip ratio of 3:1.
Wow.
The largest shoulder to hip ratio we've ever measured on this campus, and involves literally hundreds of males, was 1.69 or roughly 1.7.
Okay.
So it shows you just how exaggerated these things can become under certain environmental conditions. But what Jen found in her, as another part of her dissertation, was that females that show highly estrogenized states of mind in terms of mental state attribution are more vulnerable to disordered eating. So looking at it from the standpoint of evolutionary medicine, the extreme female brain may represent certain disadvantages. And maybe Jen could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Definitely the ideas that we had regarding waist to hip ratio and then features of what might be a female brain type, as Baron Cohen would put it, were influenced and we were heavily influenced by his ideas. And one of the goals that we outlined was, can we try to think about or come up with what if there can be different brain types based on cognitive dimensions. And Simon Baron Cohen made the argument that the male brain is more involved in tasks that require systemizing and the female brain more involved in tasks that require empathizing. And the extreme male brain could manifest if you look at, for instance, sexual selection, runaway sexual selection for testosterone-dependent traits that could manifest in some people possessing what would be an extreme male brain type. And he argues that this can manifest clinically as autism. And there's a whole book and 10 years of data that kind of speaks to this profile of the extreme male brain. But there's really only been one published study of the other side of this. And there's been some work done with Crespi and Badcock that kind of lead into what potential characteristics the extreme female brain would have, and it would have to include hyper empathizing at the expense of systemizing skills. And so we had four samples where we looked at different aspects of this question. And one thing that we found is we were looking at social anxiety and disordered eating specifically, if they could account for this profile of the extreme female brain. And we found in 3 of those samples, that the ones that we were looking for this, that disordered eating and social anxiety was correlated with empathizing quotient scores. So we were able to show that females with high levels of disordered eating, this is in the general population, not individuals with eating disorders, because there'd be a host of other potential confounding factors in a study like that, that they scored higher on empathizing skills. And in some cases, we looked at what's called an empathizing bias. And so this is when we would take the standardized scores from the empathizing and systemizing quotients, and we could actually show a brain type that would use more empathizing than systemizing. And this was also correlated with social anxiety and disordered eating. So we're trying to put that data together in a way that's meaningful now, that we could kind of share that idea as a potential candidate for the extreme female brain.
Wow. So yeah, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? And females anchor the dimension on eating disorders, right?
Right. It's the skewed sex ratios that you see in autism and Asperger's quite nicely. So, for instance, there's a 4-to-1 male to female skewed sex distribution in rates of autism, but it's 10-to-1 when you look at Asperger's. And then with eating disorders, it's 10-to-1 female to male. So this seemed like a logical place to look. But then as we were looking further, we started to think of how traits like schizotropy may actually play into it, because we know that schizotypal traits also make an impact on theory of mind performance. And if you think about the traits that go along with someone who would have an eating disorder, a lot of times it involves having delusions or hallucinations of kind of over mentalizing, maybe not over empathizing, but making mental attributions where they're over attributing what another person might be thinking about them. And that kind of fits also with social anxiety, which is the other dimension that we looked at. They might be worried or concerned with what people think about them. And these are things where you see sex differences exist to begin with. And the fact that disordered eating and social anxiety kind of fit together would go along with that. And so we also looked at schizotypal traits, and we found that there were some pretty high correlations between disordered eating and schizotropy. And it makes sense if you think about a defining characteristic of someone with an eating disorder is hearing, a voice that's telling them that they're too fat or not good enough or not to eat something. And then another interesting kind of offshoot of that is the fact that how fasting is kind of involved in a lot of different religions, and religious belief itself could be a feature of schizotropy.
So potentially lots of empirical predictive hypotheses come from this idea, this relationship between waist to hip ratio, potentially glutofemoral fat, and the extreme female brain and Darwinian medicine.
Absolutely, and Jen's data implicating disordered eating as symptomatic of the extreme female brain may also account for the well-established relationship among females in vegetarianism and disordered eating.
Yeah.
Vegetarianism predicts disordered eating in females, and we think that vegetarianism may be a reflection of empathizing. Females with extreme female brains that excel at empathizing may be more likely to eschew meat eating because they empathize with animals that are targeted for human consumption.
It makes intuitive sense, right? It makes, I mean, that's, one of the sort of vegetarian, vegan sort of landmarks is, animals are being mistreated and empathizing is high.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
killing animals for food as well.
Yeah.
The other interesting feature of the waist to hip ratio data and the gluteofemoral fat in terms of evolutionary medicine is that children that are breastfed have higher IQ scores than children that are bottle fed, and breast milk contains some of these brain building fatty acids.
Yeah.
The other interesting dimension of this involves what Gallup and Lassick refer to as maternal depletion of these gluteofemoral fat stores, so that you would predict birth order effects in terms of tested IQ scores. And in general, there are data that show that birth order is related to performance on standardized IQ tests. Children, firstborn and secondborn children, do better than thirdborn, fourthborn, and fifthborn children. And this may be a reflection of depletion, of progressive depletion of gluteofemoral fat as females bear more children. Consistent with that idea, it also turns out that a female's risk of dementia in later life, of developing Alzheimer's disease, is directly proportional to the number of children she's had.
That's right. Yeah, well, my first comment to that is I hope you don't tell those data to Andy, right? Your fifth born, right?
There are exceptions. There's exceptions to every rule.
But what's interesting about that, and totally off topic, is there's a long line of evidence on the travails that women go through for multiple births, and there's data in from every species from Drosophila on up that the more litters or offspring, the longevity of the female decreases proportionally. And it's the same idea that it's this resource allocation or resource depletion, and the fact that could be rearing its head in human populations based upon gluteofemoral fat is interesting in light, to me, from a nutritional perspective, in light of the fact that we might be able to supplement, right? And if you're depleting your natural stores of DHA and EPA and these omega-6 fatty acids, then something like taking a supplement that reinstates that fatty acid into your breast milk or into your gluteofemoral fat stores might actually be something that comes from Darwinian medicine, a means of in a sense preventive medicine from a Darwinian perspective.
That's an excellent point, Steve.
So, well, I think we're probably gonna have to wrap up because I think Jen and I probably have to go pick up our offspring.
Before you do that, let's just anchor this discussion with one more bit of data that implicates a hardwired component to the attraction that males have towards females with low waist to hip ratios. As you know, it's been discovered that people who are blind, even people who are born congenitally blind, when allowed to touch mannequins with different waist to hip ratios, identify the mannequins with the low waist to hip ratios as being more attractive. And in the case of people that are congenitally blind, that's totally independent of ever having had any visual experience with members of the opposite sex.
Absolutely. For example, that suggests that the idea that women want to be thin because of media influences is bogus.
Absolutely. That one of the biggest deterrents to reproductive health in females is fasting.
Yep.
And depleting overall levels of body fat.
Yeah.
Extreme dieting puts you on a collision course with impaired reproductive function if you're a female.
Yeah. I say to my class, I tell them that extreme dieting on the part of females is playing Russian roulette with your reproductive success.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Let me just end, and I'm not trying to get the last word here, but I do just want to add two more bits of evidence about waist to hip ratio in the mating game. Recent paper should be coming out in Evolutionary Psychology, the journal for which Gordon and I both work at, showing that what's really interesting, women are somehow attuned to their own waist to hip ratio. And what the evidence suggests is that when women are socially excluded, socially ostracized, they vary their reproductive strategy, and that's predicated upon their waist to hip ratio. So they're more likely to engage in short-term mating relationships when they're excluded. And similarly to that, I have an undergraduate student here who's showing that women are very keen to waist to hip ratio. So it seems to be an honest signal not only for intersexual competition, but also intrasexual. That is, women selectively target other optimally designed, with respect to waist to hip ratio, women for things like romantic and sexual jealousy. That is, if somebody who is not of an attractive figure is flirting with your romantic partner, you're less threatened compared to somebody who is optimally designed. So it's not just men who pay attention to it. It turns out women are very keen and target their intersexual competitive strategies, i.e. relational aggression, towards other women of optimally designed waist to hip ratio configurations.
Yeah, Andrew's shown with some of the data he collected down there at Binghamton that women are far more likely to bully women that have attractive features as a means of competing with other women for high-quality alpha males.
Wow. Yeah, it's absolutely outstanding stuff. Well, Gordon, Jen, I can't thank you guys enough. And like always, once we're recorded and cut, I'll let you guys have the link to have a look and share with your colleagues.
Sounds good, Steve. Thanks a lot.
All right, have a good one.
Bye.
Jen?
Yes.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Good. Can we talk a little bit about if you've got a minute?